The airplane hummed with activity as passengers filed in, finding their seats and stowing luggage. Two teenage girls made their way through first class, their movements poised, yet relaxed. The older sister pointed to their assigned seats by the window, and they settled in, buckling up and arranging their belongings. "Is this your first time flying alone?" asked the younger sister, her voice barely audible over the airplane's ambient noise. "We've flown together before," the older one replied with a small smile. "Remember last summer? Dad had that meeting in California, but we left early with Mom." A flight attendant moved through the cabin, helping passengers and checking seatbelts. Her name tag read Jessica, and she wore her uniform with practiced precision. She smiled professionally at the sisters as she passed, noting their composed demeanor despite their youth. "Can I get you anything before takeoff?" Jessica asked, pausing beside their seats. "Just water, please," the older sister replied politely. Jessica nodded and continued her rounds. The plane was nearly full now, with only a few passengers still boarding. The sisters chatted quietly, scrolling through their phones before the inevitable announcement to switch them off. The older sister glanced out the window. "I wonder if Dad's flight is on schedule. He texted 20 minutes ago. Said everything was going according to plan," her sister replied. "He'll meet us there." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the front of the cabin. A man in an expensive-looking suit had stopped in the aisle, frowning at his boarding pass and then at the seat numbers above the sisters. "Excuse me," he called to Jessica as she returned with the sisters' water. "There seems to be some mistake." Jessica approached him with a practiced smile. "How can I help you, sir?" The man gestured toward the seats where the sisters sat. "I always sit in 2A and 2B when I fly this route. I've flown it every month for 3 years now." Jessica checked his boarding pass. "I see you're assigned to 4C, sir. That's an aisle seat just a few rows back." The man's expression hardened. "There's clearly been a mix-up. I specifically requested these seats when I booked, as I always do." The sisters exchanged glances but remained silent, listening to the exchange. "Let me check the system," Jessica said, pulling out her tablet. After a moment, she shook her head. "I'm sorry, sir, but the system shows these seats were assigned to these passengers. Your confirmed seat is 4C. The man's face flushed slightly. "Look, I'm a platinum member. I've logged over 100,000 miles with this airline this year alone. Surely, these kids wouldn't mind moving to different seats?" At this, the sister's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. The older one straightened her back while the younger one's fingers tightened around her phone. Jessica hesitated, her eyes darting between the imposing businessman and the two young girls. The plane was full. Moving them would mean downgrading, them from first class or splitting them up. "Perhaps you girls wouldn't mind moving," Jessica finally suggested, her voice taking on an apologetic tone. "This gentleman is one of our most valued customers." The older sister spoke up, her voice calm and measured. "We're sorry, but we were assigned these seats specifically. Our party will be joining us shortly, and it's important we stay in these seats." The businessman scoffed. "Your party? What, more teenagers? Look, I have an important meeting after this flight. I need to work during the journey, and these seats provide the privacy I require." 2 rows back, a man in a dark suit shifted in his seat, watching the interaction carefully. He made brief eye contact with another similarly dressed individual across the aisle. Neither moved yet, but both seemed alert to the escalating situation. Jessica found herself in an uncomfortable position. The businessman was clearly influential with the airline, but the girls weren't being unreasonable. They were simply occupying their assigned seats. "Sir, perhaps we could offer you a complimentary beverage or meal service as an apology for the inconvenience," Jessica suggested. "That's not the point," the man insisted, his voice rising enough that nearby passengers turned to look. "It's about principle. I've been a loyal customer for years, and I'm being displaced by—" His eyes narrowed as he looked at the sisters. "Who are you girls traveling with anyway? Where are your parents?" The younger sister opened her mouth to respond, but her sister touched her arm gently, silencing her. "Our father will be joining us momentarily," the older one said simply. "Jessica, feeling the pressure of other waiting passengers and the growing tension, made a decision. Girls, I'm very sorry, but in this situation, I think it would be best if you moved. We can find you nice seats in another section. Is there a problem here? Came a new voice, deep and immediately commanding attention. The cabin seemed to still as passengers turned toward the sound. Standing in the entryway to first class was a tall man with a familiar face, now lined with a few more years of experience than when his image had been a fixture in news reports and history books. Behind him stood a woman whose elegance and poise were unmistakable, her expression questioning as she took in the scene. The flight attendant's eyes widened in recognition. The businessman's mouth opened slightly, words failing him. "Dad," the younger sister called out, her face brightening. "Mom!" The former president of the United States smiled warmly at his daughters before turning his attention to Jessica and the businessman. "I believe my daughters are seated here," he said pleasantly, gesturing to where the girls sat. "Is everything all right?" Jessica's professional demeanor momentarily cracked as she realized her mistake. "Mr. President, I didn't realize." There was a confusion about the seating arrangement. The businessman had taken a step back, his earlier confidence evaporating. "No issue at all," he said quickly. "Just a misunderstanding. I'll take my assigned seat." As the businessman retreated to his actual seat, the former First Lady made her way to her daughters, placing a gentle hand on each of their shoulders. "Everything okay?" she asked quietly. "Fine now," the older sister replied with a small smile. Jessica stood frozen, mortification washing over her. "Sir, madam, I sincerely apologize for the confusion. I didn't recognize." Her voice trailed off. The former president nodded understandingly. "No apology necessary. These things happen." His voice was kind but carried an undercurrent that acknowledged what had transpired. "I'm sure everyone is just eager to get underway." As the former First family settled into their seats, whispers rippled through the cabin. Passengers discreetly took out phones, eager to share their unexpected travel companions with friends and family before the flight took off. Jessica returned to her duties, her movements now slightly hurried, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. As she passed the businessman, now seated in 4C and staring intently at his laptop, she couldn't help but notice how small he suddenly appeared. The plane began to taxi, and the sisters leaned in close to their parents, no doubt sharing details of the encounter. The former president listened attentively, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. As the plane gathered speed and lifted into the air, Jessica couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened and what it revealed about how quickly she had been willing to displace two young women of color at the insistence of an entitled white man. The realization sat uncomfortably in her chest as the ground fell away beneath the aircraft, a weight that wouldn't be easily shed even as they climbed into the clouds. The tension in the first-class cabin lingered even after takeoff. Jessica avoided making eye contact with the former First family as she prepared the drink service, her cheeks still flushed with embarrassment. She couldn't stop replaying the scene in her mind, how quickly she had sided with the businessman, how easily she had asked those girls to move without questioning why. 20 minutes into the flight, Jessica steadied herself and approached their row with the drink cart. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her voice professional but unable to mask her discomfort. "Just water for me," the former president said with a polite smile. "I'll have cranberry juice, please," his wife added, looking up from her book. The girls requested their drinks too, and Jessica carefully handed them over, trying not to let her hands shake. As she placed a napkin beside the former president's water, she gathered her courage. "Sir, I want to apologize properly for what happened earlier," she said quietly. "I made assumptions I shouldn't have." He looked at her thoughtfully. "We all make assumptions sometimes." "That doesn't make it right," she replied. "I should have handled the situation differently." The former First Lady glanced up. "What matters is how we learn from these moments," she said, her voice kind but direct. Jessica nodded, grateful for their graciousness, yet still feeling the weight of her actions. She continued down the aisle with her cart, stopping at row 4C, where the businessman sat typing furiously on his laptop. "Something to drink, sir?" she asked. He barely looked up. "Scotch. Neat." Then, as she reached for the bottle, he added more softly, "I didn't know who they were." Jessica paused. Would it have made a difference if they weren't who they are? The question hung in the air between them. The businessman accepted his drink without answering, quickly returning to his laptop as if the screen could shield him from the discomfort of self-reflection. 3 rows behind them sat a middle-aged couple who had witnessed the entire boarding incident. The woman leaned toward her husband. "Can you believe what happened?" she whispered. "The nerve of that man. And the flight attendant didn't even stand up for those girls until she knew who their father was." Her husband nodded. "Makes you wonder how many times something like this happens without a famous parent stepping in." "Exactly," she agreed. "I'm going to say something to that flight attendant when she comes by." When Jessica reached their row, the woman didn't hesitate. "Excuse me," she said firmly. "I saw what happened during boarding, and I just want to say it was very disappointing to watch." Jessica's professional smile faltered. "I understand, ma'am. Doe." "You?" the woman pressed. "Because those girls deserve to be treated with respect regardless of who their parents are. They had assigned seats. That should have been the end of the discussion." Jessica felt her throat tighten. "You're absolutely right," she admitted. "I made a mistake." The husband, seeing Jessica's genuine remorse, softened slightly. "We all have blind spots," he said. "The important thing is to recognize them." Jessica nodded gratefully and continued her service, each interaction feeling like a small judgment on her character. She had been a flight attendant for 8 years and prided herself on treating all passengers equally, yet today had exposed a bias she hadn't fully acknowledged to herself. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, word had spread about their notable passengers. The captain decided he should acknowledge their presence and stepped out during a stable portion of the flight, leaving his co-pilot in command. He approached the former First family with a respectful nod. "Mr. President, it's an honor to have you and your family aboard today. I apologize for any inconvenience during boarding." The former president shook his hand. "No need for apologies, Captain. And please, I haven't been Mr. President for some time now." "Once a president, always a president, sir," the captain replied with a smile. "If there's anything you need during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask." As the captain returned to the cockpit, the older daughter turned to her father. "Dad, you didn't have to say anything to the flight attendant. It wasn't a big deal." He looked at her with eyes that had witnessed both the highest offices of power and the everyday indignities faced by people who looked like them. "It is a big deal," he said gently. "Not because of who we are, but because of what happened. No one should be asked to give up their rightful place simply because someone else feels more entitled to it." His wife nodded in agreement. "And it's important for you girls to understand that standing your ground isn't about being difficult. It's about dignity." The younger daughter frowned. "But what if we weren't your daughters? What if we were just regular teenagers? Nobody would have stepped in then." Her father's expression grew serious. "That's why those of us who can speak up must, and why I'm proud of you for holding your ground before we arrived." The conversation paused as the plane encountered some turbulence. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and Jessica's voice came over the intercom, professional and clear, instructing all passengers to return to their seats. Across the aisle, a young man who had been pretending not to eavesdrop couldn't help but be moved by the family's conversation. He'd voted for the former president twice and had admired him, but seeing him as a father, hearing him speak to his daughters about dignity and standing up for themselves, gave him a new perspective. When the turbulence subsided, Jessica resumed her duties, making her way back through the cabin. She noticed the businessman in 4C had finished his scotch and was now staring out the window, his laptop closed. "Another drink, sir?" she asked. He turned to her, his expression different, less entitled, more reflective. "No, thank you," he said. Then after a pause, "I've been thinking about what you asked earlier, about whether it would have made a difference if I had known who they were." He shook his head slightly. "The answer should be no. It shouldn't matter. But I reacted the way I did because I thought I could. Because I'm used to getting my way. He sighed. Not a comfortable realization at 53. Jessica appreciated his honesty. I think we're both learning something today. As she moved on, she found herself near the former first family again. The girls were watching a movie together on a shared tablet, their heads bent close, laughing at something on the screen. Their parents were reading, he with a historical biography, she with what appeared to be a legal brief, yellow sticky notes marking various pages. Jessica gathered her courage once more. "Excuse me," she said softly, not wanting to disturb the girls. Both parents looked up. "I just wanted to say what happened earlier. It made me think about how I approach my job. I'm sorry that your daughters were treated that way." The former First Lady studied her for a moment. "Have you ever heard the phrase windows and mirrors?" Jessica shook her head. "It's about education, but it applies to life too. We need windows to see into the experiences of others, and mirrors to reflect on our own actions and beliefs. Today provided both, didn't it?" Jessica nodded, struck by the wisdom in the simple analogy. "Yes, it certainly did." The former president added, "The hardest work is the work we do on ourselves. Recognizing our blind spots is just the beginning." As Jessica returned to the galley to prepare for meal service, she found herself reflecting on how a routine flight had turned into such a profound lesson. The businessman had assumed his status entitled him to special treatment. She had instinctively backed him up, despite the girls having done nothing wrong. And all of it had unfolded in front of a man who had once been the most powerful person in the world, yet who still had to worry about how his daughters would be treated when he wasn't around. The meal service began, and as Jessica moved through the cabin, she noticed small changes in how passengers interacted with each other. More smiles, more patience, more awareness. It was as if the incident had rippled through the plane, reminding everyone of basic human dignity. By the time they reached cruising altitude, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin had transformed. What had begun with tension and confrontation was evolving into something unexpected, a shared experience that prompted reflection. Jessica realized that while the flight would eventually end, the lessons from this encounter would stay with her long after they touched down. As the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, the meal service concluded, and the cabin settled into the rhythm of mid-flight quiet. Some passengers dozed, others worked on laptops, and a few, like the former first daughters, were absorbed in a movie on their shared tablet. Jessica moved through the cabin collecting trays and offering coffee, her movements more deliberate than before. The businessman in 4C had barely touched his food. When Jessica approached to take his tray, he looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Everything okay with your meal, sir?" she asked. "Fine," he replied, then hesitated. "Actually, no. Nothing's fine." His voice was low enough that only she could hear. "I keep thinking about what happened earlier." Jessica waited, sensing he had more to say. "I've been on hundreds of flights," he continued. "I'm used to getting what I want because I've earned it through my loyalty to this airline. At least that's what I tell myself." He glanced toward the former first family. "But those girls had just as much right to their seats as I did to mine. More, actually, since they were assigned there." Jessica nodded, appreciating his honesty. "It's easy to fall into patterns of thinking," she said. "I did too." "The thing is," he said, rubbing his forehead, "I have daughters too. If someone had treated them that way, I would have been furious." The realization seemed to hit him anew as he spoke the words. He shook his head slightly. "I need to make this right somehow." Jessica gathered his tray. "Perhaps an apology?" He nodded, though he looked uncertain. "Yes, though I'm not sure they'd want to hear from me." "You might be surprised," she replied. "I found them quite gracious when I apologized." As Jessica moved away, she noticed a woman across the aisle watching the exchange with interest. When their eyes met, the woman gave her a small, approving smile. It was a tiny gesture, but it felt significant. an acknowledgement of growth happening in real time. In row 2, the former president excused himself and stood to stretch his legs. He made his way toward the lavatory at the front of the cabin, nodding politely to fellow passengers who tried not to stare but couldn't help themselves. One young boy, about 10 years old, looked up from his video game as the former president passed. "My grandma says you changed history," the boy said matter-of-factly. The former president paused, smiling down at him. "History is changed by ordinary people doing extraordinary things every day," he replied. "Your grandma sounds very wise." "The call," boy beamed. "She has all your books. She makes me read them." "And what do you think of them?" the former president asked, genuinely curious. The boy scrunched up his face in thought. "Some parts are boring," he admitted, causing his mother beside him to look mortified. "But I like the stories about when you were a kid." The former president laughed, a warm, genuine sound that seemed to lighten the entire cabin. "Those are my favorite parts too," he confided. As he continued toward the lavatory, Jessica approached him. "Sir, I just wanted to let you know that the gentleman from earlier, he seems to be having second thoughts about his behavior. He mentioned wanting to apologize." The former president nodded thoughtfully. "That's good to hear, though it's my daughters who deserve the apology, not me." "Of course," Jessica agreed. "I just thought you should know." When he returned to his seat, he leaned over to his wife and whispered something that made her raise an eyebrow, then nod. After a brief family conference, the older daughter stood up and made her way to the lavatory, deliberately passing by the businessman's seat. The businessman looked up, clearly surprised to see her standing there. He removed his headphones. "Excuse me," the older daughter said, her voice carrying the same measured dignity as her father's. "I'm on my way back from the restroom, and I just wanted to say that I hope the rest of your flight is going well." It was a simple courtesy, but the intention behind it, the offering of an opportunity, was clear. The businessman seemed momentarily stunned by her graciousness. "Thank you," he said. Then, gathering himself, "Actually, I owe you and your sister an apology. My behavior during boarding was inappropriate. I made assumptions I shouldn't have made." The girl nodded, accepting his words. "Thank you for saying that. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong." "You sound like my oldest daughter," he replied with a hint of a smile. "She calls me out when I need it." "Sounds like someone I'd get along with," the girl said, returning his smile before continuing back to her seat. The exchange was brief but powerful, witnessed by several nearby passengers who had been following the unfolding drama since boarding. One elderly woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, moved by the simple act of reconciliation. Meanwhile, in the galley, Jessica was preparing for another round of drinks when she was joined by her colleague, Thomas, who worked in economy class. "So," he said in a low voice, "is it true? The Obamas are in first class?" Jessica nodded. "Yes, and please keep your voice down. They deserve their privacy." "Of course," Thomas agreed. "It's just, I voted for him, both times. I'd love to just say, thank you. They're very approachable," Jessica said. "But maybe wait for a natural moment. They've already had enough attention today." Thomas raised an eyebrow questioningly. Jessica sighed. "There was an incident during boarding. A passenger wanted their seats and I didn't handle it well." She briefly explained what had happened. Thomas listened without judgment. "We all have moments that don't show our best selves," he said finally. "The question is what you do afterward." "That's basically what the former First Lady told me," Jessica admitted. "She talked about windows and mirrors, seeing others' experiences, and reflecting on our own." "Smart woman," Thomas commented. "Always was." The plane hit a patch of turbulence, ending their conversation as they secured loose items in the galley. When the aircraft steadied, Jessica returned to the cabin with fresh drinks. As she approached the former First Family's row, she noticed the younger daughter writing intently in a journal, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her older sister was reading a thick novel, occasionally making notes in the margins. "Would anyone like a refreshment?" Jessica asked. The former president requested water again, while his wife opted for hot tea. The girls asked for ginger ale and apple juice. As Jessica carefully placed their drinks, the younger daughter looked up from her journal. "I'm writing about what happened today," she said, "for my social studies class. We're studying social dynamics and power structures." Jessica smiled, impressed but not surprised by the girl's academic focus. "That's a perfect, real-world example." "That's what I thought," the girl agreed. "I'm interested in how quickly the situation changed once people realized who we were." She glanced at her parents. "Dad always says that character is revealed in how you treat people when you don't know who they are." Her father nodded. "And in how you treat people who can do nothing for you," he added. Jessica felt those words settle deep within her. How many times had she given preferential treatment to first-class passengers simply because of their status? How often had she made assumptions about people based on their appearance or age? As she moved away, the businessman approached the former First Family's row, standing respectfully at the edge of their space. Jessica slowed her cart, watching from the corner of her eye. "Excuse the interruption," he said. "I've already spoken with your daughter, but I wanted to apologize to all of you. My behavior earlier was inexcusable." The former First Lady studied him thoughtfully before responding. "Thank you for saying that. It takes character to acknowledge when we've been wrong." The former president extended his hand. "What's done is done. Let's move forward." The businessman shook his hand, visibly relieved. "Thank you, sir and ma'am." He nodded to both girls. "Enjoy the rest of your flight." As he returned to his seat, several passengers who had been pretending not to watch the interaction exchanged glances. Something small but meaningful had transpired. A human moment of accountability and forgiveness. The flight continued on, the tension from earlier completely dissolved. Jessica found herself moving through the cabin with a lighter step, the weight of her earlier mistake lifted by the opportunity to learn from it. Near the end of the drink service, she found herself beside the 10-year-old boy who had spoken to the former president earlier. "Can I have another soda?" he asked hopefully. "One is the limit," his mother reminded him. The boy sighed dramatically. It was worth a try. Jessica smiled at him. "How about some water with a little juice mixed in? That's what I drink when I'm thirsty but don't want plain water." "Okay," he agreed. As she prepared his drink, he looked at her with curiosity. "Did you know who they were right away?" he asked, nodding toward the former First Family. "Not right away, no," Jessica admitted, keeping her voice low. "But they're famous," the boy said, clearly puzzled. His mother touched his arm. "That's the point, sweetheart. People should be treated well because they're people, not because they're famous." The boy considered this, his young face serious. "So if I'm nice to everyone, I'm covering all my bases, right?" The adults laughed, surprised by his practical reasoning. "That's one way to look at it," Jessica agreed, handing him his drink. "But being kind is its own reward." As she returned to the galley, Jessica glanced back at the cabin. The former president was helping his younger daughter with something in her journal. His wife was deep in conversation with their older daughter. The businessman was writing something on his laptop, his expression thoughtful. Ordinary moments in an extraordinary situation. A reminder that beneath titles and status, they were all simply people sharing a journey through the sky. The flight entered its third hour, that peculiar time when the initial excitement of travel has worn off and passengers settle into the limbo of being neither here nor there. Outside the windows, the sky had darkened into evening, turning the glass into mirrors that reflected the cabin's warm lighting and the faces of those inside. Jessica finished restocking the beverage cart and checked her watch. Just over an hour until landing. She'd been a flight attendant long enough to anticipate the rhythm of flights, the way passengers grew restless in this final stretch, the small ways tension could build in confined spaces. As she moved through the aisle checking on passengers, she noticed the former president was now alone in his row. His wife and daughters had apparently moved elsewhere temporarily. He was reading a book, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, looking remarkably ordinary despite his extraordinary life. "Everything all right with your family, sir?" Jessica asked as she collected an empty water cup from his tray. He looked up with a smile. My wife is chatting with a law professor from Georgetown who recognized her. They have some mutual colleagues. And my daughters. He glanced toward the back of the plane. They've made friends with some kids in economy. My younger one convinced me they should be allowed to visit. Jessica nodded, picturing the scene in the back of the plane, the surprise and excitement of those economy passengers when the former first daughters appeared among them. Your daughters seem very grounded, Jessica observed. We try, he replied, his voice carrying the weight of a parent who knows the world will not always be kind. It's not easy raising children in the spotlight. We've always wanted them to understand both their privilege and their responsibilities. A voice came over. Jessica's radio, and she excused herself to answer it. Thomas, her colleague from economy, was calling. Just a heads up, he said, his voice crackling through the small speaker. We've got a situation back here. Jessica felt her stomach tighten. What kind of situation? Nothing serious, Thomas assured her. But there's a woman who recognized the girls. She's being a bit aggressive with her political opinions. I think the older one is handling it well, but I thought you should know. I'll let their father know, Jessica replied, turning back toward row 2. The former president listened to her explanation, his expression calm but concerned. I'll go check on them, he said, standing up. Thank you for letting me know. As he made his way toward economy, Jessica couldn't help but follow at a discreet distance, curious how he would handle the situation. The scene at the back of the plane came into view as they approached. The former first daughters were sitting in an empty row, surrounded by a small group of teenagers who appeared to be on a school trip. Nearby, a middle-aged woman was leaning over her seat, speaking animatedly to the older daughter. And your father's policies destroyed our healthcare system, the woman was saying, her voice carrying despite her attempt to keep it down. My premiums tripled. The older daughter maintained remarkable composure. I understand you're frustrated, she replied. Healthcare is complicated and people have different experiences with policy changes. It's not complicated, the woman insisted. Excuse me. The former president's voice, though quiet, carried a natural authority that immediately drew everyone's attention. I believe I heard my name mentioned. The woman turned, her eyes widening as she realized who had joined the conversation. The teenagers fell silent, staring in awe. Mr. President, the woman stammered, clearly caught off guard. I was just expressing my concerns about healthcare to your daughter. He nodded, his expression neither defensive nor confrontational. I'd be happy to discuss those concerns with you myself, he said. My daughters are here as private citizens, not as political representatives. The woman had the grace to look embarrassed. Of course, I didn't mean to corner them. Dad, it's okay, the older daughter said. We were having a civil conversation. He gave his daughter a proud smile before turning back to the woman. Healthcare reform wasn't perfect, he acknowledged. No major policy ever is. I'm genuinely sorry your premiums increased. That wasn't the intention. The woman seemed disarmed by his directness. I appreciate that, she said, her tone softening. It's just been hard for my family. I understand, he replied, and I'd like to hear more about your experience if you're willing to share it. As the former president took a seat across from the woman and began a quiet conversation, the teenagers looked at each other in disbelief, witnessing a moment they'd likely remember for years to come. Jessica, watching from the aisle, felt a tap on her shoulder. It was Thomas. Did you see that? He whispered. The way he diffused the tension? No defensiveness, no talking down to her. Jessica nodded. Leadership isn't just about big speeches and world-changing decisions. It's about how you handle the small moments, too. One of the teenagers, a girl with bright eyes and a streak of blue in her hair, approached the younger first daughter. Are you okay? That lady was being pretty intense. The younger daughter shrugged. We're used to it. People have strong feelings about my dad. Still, another teen chimed in. You shouldn't have to deal with that on a plane. Or anywhere, really. The younger daughter smiled. Thanks. Anyway, You were telling me about your robotics club? Just like that, the conversation shifted back to normal teenage topics, school projects, favorite music, complaints about parents' rules. Jessica marveled at how quickly the girls could pivot from a politically charged confrontation to ordinary, adolescent chit-chat. Meanwhile, the former president continued his conversation with the critical woman, their discussion evolving into something resembling mutual understanding, if not agreement. Other economy passengers watched with undisguised interest, some even taking discreet photos with their phones. Thomas appeared at Jessica's side again. We'll be starting descent preparation soon. The girls should probably return to their seats. Jessica nodded and approached the former president, waiting for a pause in his conversation. I'm sorry to interrupt, sir, but we'll be beginning our descent shortly. He thanked the woman for sharing her perspective, promised to keep her concerns in mind, and stood to collect his daughters. The teens said their goodbyes, exchanging social media information with the first daughters and making plans to stay in touch. As the former first family made their way back to first class, they passed the businessman in 4C. He looked up from his laptop and gave them a respectful nod, which they returned. Once they were resettled in their seats, Jessica noticed the former first lady had returned as well. She was listening intently as her husband quietly recounted what had happened. In economy, you turned it into a teaching moment, she said when he finished, her voice carrying a hint of admiration despite years of marriage. For everyone involved. He shrugged. I just didn't want the girls to bear the brunt of someone's frustration with me. That's part of being in public life, she reminded him gently. They'll face more of that as they grow up. I know, he sighed, but not on my watch if I can help it. The plane began its descent, the change in altitude causing ears to pop and babies to cry. Jessica moved efficiently through the cabin, checking that seatbelts were fastened and tray tables stowed. When she reached the former first family's row, she found them already prepared for landing, everything in order. I want to thank you, the former first lady said unexpectedly as Jessica checked their seatbelts. Thank me? Jessica was surprised. After how I behaved during boarding, the former first lady shook her head. For showing growth, for acknowledging a mistake and learning from it. That's all any of us can do. Jessica felt unexpected emotion rise in her throat. Thank you, ma'am. That means a lot. As she moved on, checking the rest of the cabin, Jessica passed the businessman who had caused the initial confrontation. He was staring out the window, his expression contemplative. Preparing for landing, sir, she reminded him. Please make sure your seat is upright. He adjusted his seat and then looked at her directly. I've been thinking about this whole flight, he said. About entitlement and assumptions, about how I behaved. Jessica waited, sensing he had more to say. I have 3 daughters, he continued. I've always taught them to stand up for themselves, to know their worth. Yet today I tried to make someone else's daughters feel less worthy of their space. He shook his head. It's not who I want to be. Recognition is the first step to change, Jessica offered. He nodded thoughtfully. Maybe this flight was exactly what I needed. The plane descended through clouds, the city lights below growing closer. Jessica returned to her jump seat and buckled in for landing. As the wheels touched down with a gentle bump, she found herself reflecting on the journey, not just the physical distance covered, but the emotional territory they had all traversed. A simple flight from one city to another had become something more, a microcosm of society, with all its flaws and potential for growth. Mistakes had been made, apologies offered, lessons learned. Boundaries had been both challenged and respected. Conversations had taken place that might never have happened on solid ground. And as the plane taxied to the gate, Jessica realized that everyone on board, from the former leader of the free world to the ordinary passengers in economy, was carrying something new with them as they prepared to disembark. Something that couldn't be packed in a suitcase or carried in a hand, but that would perhaps change how they moved through the world tomorrow. The plane came to a complete stop at the gate, and the familiar chime signaled that passengers could unbuckle their seatbelts. Despite the late hour, A buzz of energy filled the cabin as people reached for bags in overhead compartments and checked phones that had been in airplane mode for hours. Jessica stood near the front of the plane preparing for deplaning. Through the cockpit's open door, she could see the captain finishing his post-flight checks. He caught her eye and raised an eyebrow questioningly. Jessica gave a small nod and smile, silently communicating that everything had gone well with their notable passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Welcome to our destination. Local time is 9:45 p.m., and the temperature is a pleasant 68 degrees. On behalf of our entire crew, I'd like to thank you for flying with us today." As passengers began to stand and gather their belongings, Jessica noticed the former president remain seated, allowing others to move first. His family followed his lead, showing none of the impatience that often characterized first-class passengers eager to be the first off the plane. The businessman from 4C collected his laptop bag and paused in the aisle. He seemed to be debating whether to say something more to the former first family. After a moment's hesitation, he simply nodded respectfully in their direction and moved toward the exit. "Thank you for flying with us," Jessica said as he reached the door. He stopped briefly. "This was certainly a flight to remember," he said quietly. Then with unexpected candor, "I'm going to call my daughters tonight when I get to my hotel. I need to make sure they know that they never need to give up their seat for anyone." Jessica smiled. "That sounds like an important conversation." As he left, she watched him walk up the jetway with a different posture than he'd had boarding the plane. Less entitled somehow, more thoughtful. The deplaning continued steadily, with many passengers slowing as they passed row 2, trying to catch a glimpse of the former first family without being too obvious. The former president acknowledged them with warm nods but remained engaged in conversation with his wife and daughters. The 10-year-old boy who had spoken to the former president earlier walked by with his mother. He stopped abruptly at their "Oh, I drew this for you," he said, holding out a piece of paper to the younger daughter. "Since you're writing about today for school." She accepted it with genuine interest. On the paper was a child's drawing of the airplane with stick figures inside, some larger than others, clearly meant to represent adults and children. One figure stood out, drawn taller than the rest. "Is this my dad?" she asked, pointing to the tallest figure. The boy nodded. "And that's the man who wanted your seats," he said, pointing to another figure. "And that's you and your sister saying no." In the drawing, the stick figures resenting the girls had speech bubbles containing the word "no" in capital letters. "I love it," she said with a grin. "Can I keep it?" "That's why I made it," the boy replied matter-of-factly, before his mother gently urged him forward. When most of the first-class cabin had emptied, Jessica approached the former first family. "There's a staff member waiting to escort you through the terminal," she informed them. "Whenever you're ready." The former president thanked her, then turned to his family. "Ready?" His wife nodded, gathering her purse, while the girls collected their backpacks from under the seats. As they stood to leave, the older daughter turned to Jessica. "Thank you for everything," she said. "Today had some rough moments, but I think everyone learned something." Jessica was struck by the maturity in her words. "I certainly did," she admitted. "And I want you to know that what happened during boarding, that's not the standard we aim for." "We know," the younger daughter chimed in. "Dad always says you can't judge a whole system by one bad experience." Her father placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Though we should always work to make the system better," he added, "so fewer people have those bad experiences." The former First Lady stepped forward, extending her hand to Jessica. "It takes courage to acknowledge when we've made a mistake," she said. "That's something I always tried to teach in the East Wing, that true leadership includes accountability." Jessica shook her hand, feeling the weight of the moment. "It's a lesson I won't forget," she promised. As the family prepared to exit, Thomas, the flight attendant from economy, appeared at the front of the plane. His eyes widened when he saw the former president standing there. "Sir," he said, his voice filled with unexpected emotion. I just wanted to say thank you. My brother was able to marry his partner because of your Supreme Court appointments. It changed his life. Our whole family's life, really." The former president smiled warmly. "Those justices made those decisions, not me. But I'm glad your brother found happiness." "Still," Thomas insisted, "you made it possible. Some things are worth acknowledging." The former president nodded, accepting the gratitude with grace. "How long have you been flying?" he asked Thomas. 12 years, Thomas replied. "Quite a view of humanity you must have from these isles," the former president observed. Thomas laughed softly. "You see it all up here, sir, the good, the bad, and everything in between, just like in the White House," the former First Lady added with a knowing smile. With final goodbyes exchanged, the family made their way to the exit. Jessica and Thomas stood at the door, watching as they were met by an airline representative who would guide them through the terminal. "That was something else," Thomas said, shaking his head slightly. "In all my years flying, I've never seen anything quite like today." "Me neither," Jessica agreed. "And hopefully never again, at least the bad parts." The cleaning crew arrived, ready to prepare the plane for its next journey. Jessica and Thomas gathered their belongings from the crew area and prepared to leave. They walked up the jetway together. Thomas asked, "So what exactly happened during boarding? I heard bits and pieces, but not the whole story." Jessica recounted the incident, the businessman's demands, her own failure to stand up for the girls, the former president's timely arrival. As she spoke, she realized how differently she now viewed her own actions. "The thing is," she concluded, "I've always thought of myself as fair-minded. I would have said I treat all passengers equally, but today showed me that's not always true." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "We all have blind spots. The question is whether we're willing to see them when they're pointed out to us." They reached the end of the jetway and entered the quiet terminal. Most passengers had already dispersed to baggage claim or ground transportation. In the distance, Jessica caught a glimpse of the former First Family being escorted through a side door, away from the main concourse. "Do you think they deal with that kind of thing often?" she wondered aloud. "Being treated differently because of how they look, until people realize who they are?" "Probably more than we could imagine," Thomas replied, "though I doubt they usually have someone as important as a former president showing up to set things straight." "That's just it," Jessica said. "What about all the people who don't have someone powerful to intervene for them? They just have to deal with it." They walked in silence for a moment, the implications of her words hanging between them. "Maybe that's why today matters," Thomas finally said. "Because we all saw what happened and can't unsee it now." As they reached the crew checkout area, Jessica noticed the businessman from 4C standing near a rental car counter. He was on his phone, speaking animatedly. "No, honey, listen," she overheard him saying. "I'm trying to tell you something important. It doesn't matter who someone is or what they look like. Their space is their space, period." Jessica smiled to herself as she signed out for the day. One conversation, changing another conversation, rippling outward in ways she couldn't track. Outside the airport, the night air felt refreshingly cool after hours in the recycled atmosphere of the plane. Jessica and Thomas waited for the crew shuttle that would take them to their hotel. "Got any flights tomorrow?" Thomas asked. "Not until the afternoon," Jessica replied. "You?" "Early morning to Chicago," he said. "But I'm glad I was on this one today." Jessica nodded in agreement. "Me too, surprisingly enough." The shuttle appeared around the corner, its headlights cutting through the darkness. As it pulled up to the curb, Jessica took one last look at the airport terminal behind them, a temporary crossing of paths for so many lives, including those on today's flight. Tomorrow, she would board another plane with different passengers. There would be other challenges, other decisions to make in the moment, but she would carry today's lessons with her, about assumptions and entitlement, about standing up for what's right, about the power of acknowledgement and apology. As she stepped onto the shuttle, Jessica knew that somewhere in the city, a former president was telling his daughters he was proud of how they had handled themselves. A businessman was having an important conversation with his own daughters about respect and dignity. A 10-year-old boy was likely telling anyone who would listen about his encounter with history, and all because of a seemingly small moment on an ordinary flight, a moment that reminded everyone involved that how we treat each other in everyday interactions reveals more about our character than grand gestures ever could. The shuttle doors closed and they pulled away from the curb, leaving the airport behind. But the ripple effects of Flight 1257 would continue long after the plane itself was prepared for its next journey, carrying forward in changed perspectives and small, important choices about how to move through the world with more awareness, more empathy, and more respect for every person's rightful place.